Hi, everyone. My name is Allison Posey, and I'm really looking forward to chatting with you about unlearning to design for greater equity. So cheers to this 2021 Inclusion Collaborative Conference. And please feel free to reach out to me at any point via email. I'm at aposey@cast.org, or you can find me on Twitter at Allison A. Posey. So just a quick welcome to you all and opportunity for introductions. I work at CAST, which is the organization that founded the UDL, Universal Design for Learning Guidelines. And I've been here for 10 years now. And in that time, I've worked with educators across the United States and around the world to implement universal design for learning. And I've done a lot of learning in that process. It's been amazing to get to see how UDL can really be this framework that can go across any age group, any content area, anywhere learning is happening. We can implement UDL to really design for greater equity. And I do appreciate greatly the increased focus on accessibility and equity that's happened through the COVID-19 and the past 2 years of us really just focusing in on how are we meeting the needs of all of our learners through our design. So I can't wait to chat more with you about that today in this session. Prior to my work at CAST, I earned a degree in mind, brain, and education. So I love to think about how neuroscience can be applied to classroom practice and vice versa. And before that, I was a high school and community college science instructor. I still get to teach graduate courses at LaSalle University, which is just outside of Boston. I have two kiddos who are 17 and 20 now, which make me feel very old. And some of my favorite things to do are to jog and hike, and I love sunsets and nature. So I try to get out every day and with a little piece of dark chocolate, exercise and see some beautiful nature. So that's a little bit about me. I hope you'll introduce yourselves either in an email or on Twitter. So as I mentioned, our goal for today is to build your UDL background wherever you are in your Universal Design for Learning journey. I hope that you're able to build some background today through this lens specifically on unlearning and equity. So we really want to increase your knowledge about inclusion and equity. Think about supporting next steps to really design for inclusion and equity in your own context, your school, your district. So I hope that we together will brainstorm some strategies to infuse into your work. And I do invite you to pause this video at any point and reflect on your goals for today. What do you hope to learn? What do you hope to gain? Why did you choose this session? And so I do invite you to pause at any point and pause the video and reflect. I'm sorry, I'm just turning on my transcription here so I can make sure we have transcriptions. There we go. And so I do invite you to reflect on your goal and what you hope to learn and unlearn in order to design for greater equity with UDL. First, I want to dig into some of the essential big ideas of UDL. So for some of you, this may be familiar content. For others, this may be new. But I always like to start with kind of giving my current elevator pitch of what is UDL. So regardless of, maybe you are an expert in the UDL field. Sometimes we call them UDL rock stars. I hope you gain something from this quick description. I invite you all to take a moment and craft your own definition of what is UDL. If you had to summarize the essential big ideas for universal design for learning, what would you include in those? It may be the same as what you thought when you first learned about UDL, or it may be tweaked over time as you continue to learn and implement and learn and implement and iterate and redesign and connect and communicate with others. So again, feel free to pause this video and just jot down or draw or dictate, however you craft out of molding clay. What are your essential big ideas for UDL? And then I'll give you mine here. The first big idea for me with UDL is to frame barriers in the environment, not in the learner. And that sounds so simple, But in fact, in my decades of work in the education system, it is one of the biggest challenges that I still wrestle with myself. And that is often we frame learning to be, or the barriers to be in the individual. So we might say this student isn't engaged. This student can't access this. This student isn't able to. You fill in the blank of whatever that is. And UDL really pushes us to frame barriers in the environment, not in the learner. And what is so exciting about that, the reason this small idea is actually an essential big idea that can transform entire systems, I believe, is that we have the power to change the learning environment. And based on how we craft learning environments, our interactions and the way our students interact in those environments will change and will actually literally change the neurobiology of their neural networks based on how they're interacting in those environments. So that I think is really empowering. And in fact, with UDL, as we frame barriers in the environment, we actually empower learners themselves to start advocating for what they need. You know, when they say, oh, I'm struggling to read this, we can say, wait a minute, there's a barrier in the text. How can we maybe provide some flexible options in the text to make sure you're able to access that content? Is it to have the text read aloud? Is it to peer read? Is it to be able to have more visual images? Is it to break up the reading into smaller chunks? Whatever that is, you are empowering learners with UDL to change the environment, not themselves, which I think is pretty darn exciting. So here is a cartoon. It's offthemark.com, and they have some dinosaurs who are sitting in rows. They're like dinosaur students, and there are lots of different kinds of dinosaurs. There's variability. And then there's a teacher dinosaur who's up at the front of the room saying, looks like it'll be another F in class participation, Rex. So all the dinosaurs are raising their hands, but T-Rex, who has their variability in arm length, who has on the short end of that spectrum, short arms, is saying this is so unfair because when he goes to raise his hand, it's not even visible. So it seems as though he's not participating. So we could say, you know what, T-Rex is just not able to participate. Or with this UDL big idea, we say, you know what, the barrier to participation is in the design of the environment. What are some flexible options we could create so that T-Rex is able to participate and demonstrate what he knows? So again, that shift is subtle, but it's really empowering. And I'm sure you have some ideas. I hope you share them on Twitter or just jot down some notes because it's fun to think about. I also, in my work at CAST, have started to focus in more deeply on the definition of accessibility. So accessibility, or it's also written as ALLY, because I have learned from my colleague, especially Luis Perez and Mindy Johnson, that accessibility has 11 letters between the A and the Y, so it can be abbreviated ALLY. In the US, the Department of Education, the Office for Civil Rights, has defined accessibility as a person with a disability can acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services, equally effective, equally integrated, with substantially equivalent ease of use as a person without a disability. And what CAST and UDL really tries to push on that definition to say, you know what, every person can acquire that same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services, equally effective, equally integrated, and with substantially equivalent ease of use from the beginning. And this requires intentional design. And sometimes we hear with UDL, it takes a little more time. It does. But it ensures that we're giving our students, every student, access from the beginning to our content and curriculum. And that ends up ultimately saving us time and engaging more learners in the process. So I would argue that that's some time well spent. So I do invite you to think about this definition of accessibility and thinking about accessibility in the context of UDL. So accessibility, of course, is essential. If you are not even interested, or if you can't even perceive, or if you can't physically show what you know, that's a required first step. But ultimately with UDL, we're wanting to build much more engaged learning where students and learners are sustaining effort and persistence. They're building their language. They're expressing and communicating what they know. And we want this deep internalized learning where learners are able to self-regulate, to comprehend, and to use their executive function skills to set goals and monitor their progress and abandon plans when they're not working for them. And ultimately, this will get us to expert learning. So these learners who are purposeful and motivated, resourceful and knowledgeable, and strategic and goal-directed. So I love this idea that accessibility is really, if you look at the top row of the UDL guidelines, it's really called out there. I would make the argument that accessibility needs to be considered throughout, but it is in the context of those UDL guidelines. And in the introduction to the UDL guidelines by CAST in 2012, they state the purpose of education is not to make information accessible, but rather to teach learners how to transform accessible information into usable knowledge. So our required first step is making sure that that information is accessible. So right now, if you can't hear, I hope that you can access the transcript. If you can't see, I hope you're able to hear for whatever reason. I don't need to know the reason, but there could be barriers in how this information is being presented. So we need to make sure that there's more than one way. There's more than one option for you to be able to access that content. So then you can transform that content into usable knowledge. Oh, I just love it. And there are some great resources. Our AIM Center, CAST AIM Center, if you go to aim.cast.org, they have a site that I think is particularly useful called Designing for Accessibility with POUR. And POUR is an acronym for making sure your materials are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So they have fabulous videos, they have strategies, they have ways you can transform Google Docs or videos or other resources to make sure they are accessible. So there's your first resource. Go to aim.cast.org and check out this accessibility with POUR site and really think deeply about the way you're designing for accessibility. Because, and this again is from my colleague, thank you, Luis Perez, who says that designing for accessibility is like baking a blueberry muffin. You can't add the blueberries at the end and call it a blueberry muffin. So that's Cordelia Dillon. Of course, a blueberry muffin is all about having the blueberries infused throughout from the beginning. So we don't want our lessons to look like a muffin and then we stick a bunch of stuff on at the end for kids who can't get to that muffin. That's not accessibility. That's not universal design for learning. So we're thinking about infusing these from the beginning. And yes, it takes a little more time to do, like I mentioned, but it absolutely is worth it. The second big idea that, especially for me in my background in mind, brain, and education, has really resonated is our understanding of learner variability. We know that there are not right or left brain people. There are not isolated learning styles in our brain. But in fact, our brain is this wonderfully interconnected, large networks, growing, developing, changing brain that can change based on how we're interacting with the environment. It can change in the matter of days. Of course, over the year and a half plus in COVID, our brains have absolutely changed based on how we're interacting with our environment. So this is an image from the Human Connectome Project and really is a wonderful way of seeing just how many neural networks there are. So these are showing diffuser tensor images that show the white matter tracks that connect all these different parts of the brain and the brain within the body. And then of course, they're responding to our environment. So our brains are not isolated, but they are constantly in this system and they are anticipating what's going to happen, what they think is going to happen, and budgeting the body's energy to meet those needs, to meet those demands. And then they're responding to what happens and they're growing and changing, predicting. So instead of just saying, oh, I'm a visual learner, or, oh, I have a kinesthetic learner and I have an auditory learner and I have a visual learner, we know that that's not what's going on inside of our students, our learners' brains, or our brains anymore. We know instead that there's this big idea of variability. And so our colleague at CAST, previous colleague at CAST, Todd Rose, has developed this idea of there being a jagged profile. And this, we've kind of pushed on this idea of the jagged profile, my co-author, Katie Novak and I, thinking about how we might even use the UDL guidelines themselves to think about dimensions of variability in different contexts. So we have just taken the 9 UDL guidelines. You could pick any skills here. Think of skills that are important for your class. Maybe think of skills that are important for you to cook dinner if that's your goal. You can list out those skills. So here, the 9 UDL guidelines are thinking about, what's the student interest or effort and persistence, or there's going to be a range of self-regulation, a range in students' perception and language and background knowledge. There'll be a range in how learners physically navigate and communicate and demonstrate and use those executive function skills. So there will always be this jagged learning profile, but in every context it changes. If all of a sudden, it's a new topic, this jagged profile will change. Or if I'm in a new situation, this jagged profile will change. This gives us a new language for thinking about learning and learners that I think can be really important to integrate into our classrooms and routines. So there's resource and strategy idea number 2. Think about how you might use this idea of the jagged profile that's really more about dimensions of variability, strengths and challenges in different contexts. And of course, we know that learner variability is predictable, right? We know our learners are going to vary. So instead of having a one-size-fits-all lesson and then saying, okay, I'm going to go, add some blueberries on over here for this student, add some strawberries over here for this student, add blueberries and strawberries for this student, we're instead going to predict and anticipate this learner variability and intentionally design that quote unquote blueberry muffin from the beginning to engage our students to make sure they can perceive and build their background and that they can express and communicate themselves. So this is how learner variability and brain science connects to what we are designing in our classrooms and in our learning spaces. So whether you're a classroom teacher thinking about lessons, a principal or administrator thinking about how you're communicating with families, how you're running faculty meetings and professional development for staff, whether you're a district leader, maybe looking at curriculum, you can really take these 3 UDL principles and think about how there is flexibility built in from the beginning to make sure that everyone is able to acquire that information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy those same services, equally effective, equally integrated, and with equivalent ease of use. So we've oftentimes shared this dinner party analogy that if I were to have you all over for dinner and serve you this Mexican lasagna that has layers of noodles and meat and red sauce and beans and corn and cheese melted over the top and some scallions sprinkled, we know it's not going to work for many of you for so many reasons. Maybe you are gluten intolerant. Maybe you're a vegetarian. Maybe you just don't like it when your food touches. Maybe you just had a root canal and something hot isn't going to feel good. So when we design a proactive buffet for our learners, that actually is going to make sure that more students are able to gain access and be able to build the skills they need in that learning environment. But in order to build that buffet, you have to know the goal, because otherwise I'm just going into my cabinets and I'm throwing together a whole bunch of options and no one's going to know how to use them or if they like them or if they're working. We have to, in our learning experiences, really understand our goal. And it can come from standards. It can come from social emotional components like communication and self-regulation. It can come from skills that we're building like reading and public speaking, but we have to know the goal for every learning experience. And once we know the goal, then we know how to be flexible. So that brings us then to the UDL design process, where we can think about how could we design differently? How can we set clear goals that our students, our learners themselves know? How can we anticipate where they may be stuck and face these barriers, these roadblocks? And then we can use the UDL guidelines to really infuse options from the beginning, or baking them in our blueberry muffin from the start. So we no longer just have a single worksheet. We no longer just have a single activity that everyone is expected to do at more or less the same time, but we have a goal, and those activities or those handouts or those readings are all going to be flexibly used by our students in service of those goals. And we're going to make sure that there are those flexible options so that they can access and build their skills and engage in meaningful learning. So I know that was a little bit longer than one elevator talk of what is UDL, But that is my summary of what is UDL, the essential big ideas for universal design for learning. So I again invite you to pause the video here, reflect on what resonated, reflect on what might have been new, and craft your own. What are your essential big ideas for universal design for learning? And I'll see you back in a few. You can draw, you can type, you can tweet, however, sculpt, whatever works best for you, voice type. Welcome back. We're going to shift to this second part where we're going to think about, in a field of education where we think so much about learning, I'm going to challenge you to now think about unlearning. What has been something you've had to unlearn recently? So I would say for me, especially during COVID, I had to unlearn many things. So for example, I had to unlearn how to go to the grocery store. I had to stop bringing my own bags. I had to start remembering to wear my mask and stay 6 feet away from everyone else. I couldn't touch all the different fruit. I had to unlearn that, and I had to, visually just grab one. So I've had to unlearn how I go to the grocery store during COVID. And it was hard. I found myself sometimes after grocery shopping more tired. And I didn't know why, because I like grocery shopping, but I would come out more tired because I was actively having to unlearn and change and shift some of my habits, some of my tried and true practices in my grocery shopping. And here's another great example of unlearning. So I want to share just this quick video.
Welcome back to Smarter Every Day. You've heard people say it's just like riding a bike, meaning it's really easy and you can't forget how to do it, right? But I did something that damaged my mind. It happened on the streets of Amsterdam, and I got really scared, honestly. I can't ride a bike like you can anymore. Before I show you the video of what happened, I need to tell you the backstory. Like many 6-year-olds with a MacGyver mullet, I learned how to ride a bike when I was really young. I had learned a life skill, and I was really proud of it. Everything changed, though, when my friend Barney called me 25 years later. Where I work, the welders are geniuses, and they like to play jokes on the engineers. He had a challenge for me. He had built a special bicycle, and he wanted me to try to ride it. He had only changed one thing. When you turn the handlebar to the left, the wheel goes to the right. When you turn it to the right, the wheel goes to the left. I thought this would be easy, so I hopped on the bike, ready to demonstrate how quickly I could conquer this.
And here he is, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Destin Sandlin. First attempt riding the bicycle.
All right. So that's where I go to that. Yeah.
I couldn't do it. You can see that I'm laughing, but I'm actually really frustrated. In this moment, I had a really deep revelation. My thinking was in a rut. This bike revealed a very deep truth to me. I had the knowledge of how to operate the bike, but I did not have the understanding. Once you have a rigid way of thinking in your head, sometimes you cannot change that, even if you want to.
So I think this happens a lot with universal design for learning. We have the knowledge of what those big ideas are around UDL, but we don't often have the understanding of how to implement it. And this is where my colleague Katie Novak and I came up with the Unlearning cycle. And we hope that this 5-step process really helps you to unlearn those tried and true practices and trade up for more equitable and engaging learning experiences. And the Universal Design for Learning, the UDL guidelines that were developed by CAST, those are a fabulous tool to help us do that. So the first step, so what I'm going to do is go through the steps first, and then I'm going to work through an example. And then I hope from that worked example, you then feel equipped to be able to go and implement this a little more on your own, recognizing that just like Destin Sandler on the bike found, that one small shift can actually have a ripple effect and change many things. UDL and some of those big ideas that I shared at the very beginning might seem so simple. You just change the brake. So when you turn right, you're going to turn left. When you turn left, you're going to turn right. But in fact, it has to shift a whole lot of other things in order to make that happen. So that is what we have found in implementing UDL, and it can take time. And there are small steps that you can do along the way to get you there. So we want to recognize and value that process and know that implementing UDL doesn't just happen after a quick training, but it can take years to really unlearn some of those practices that are so steeped in our school and education systems, and they aren't always equitable. They aren't always engaging or even accessible. So the first step, so there are 5 steps. The first is understanding variability. And then the second is to know your goals. The third then is to transform a tried and true technique. The fourth is to prioritize engagement. And the fifth is to scaffold for expert learning. So let's take a look. The first, understand variability, stage 1, we've already talked about a lot. When you, we're thinking about variability, not learning labels, not learning styles, not an assumption that a student is a level 1 reader or, you know, a level 3 in their math skills. No, we're recognizing that there is variability in different contexts. If I'm reading something I love, I might be a different reader than if I'm reading what I have to standing in front of the class. So the context matters, that variability is real. And we can use the UDL guidelines to think about those 9 dimensions of variability that we can anticipate. So I already shared those. So you're thinking about recruiting interest, sustaining effort and persistence, and self-regulation. We're thinking about variability, the full range of perception, language and symbols, and comprehension, and the full range of action and expression, physical action, expression and communication, and executive functions. These are 9 dimensions of variability that are a great starting point for thinking about variability. To learn more about the UDL guidelines, you can pause right here if you would like, or at any point, and go to udlguidelines.cast.org. And you will find that this online website has links you can click on and ideas and different ways that you can frame the UDL guidelines, that there are some frequently asked questions and downloadables that you can get to. So the first stage in the unlearning cycle is to understand variability. And then, as we already mentioned, it's so critical to know your goal. So detangle your goal. No, is it about content? Like, I want students to learn the stages of cell division, or the causes of the Revolutionary War, or the phases of the moon. Maybe there's content that you want them to know. Or maybe it's about a skill. You're wanting students to learn about reading fluency, or you're wanting them to be able to deliver a public speech, or be able to work collaboratively in a group. That might be a skill. And critical to your goal is to know what success looks like. So if you're wanting students to learn the stages of cell division, you need to know what those stages are and let them know what they need to know. If they are, learning to read with fluency, define what that means. What does fluent reading mean? And build out what that success is. Have examples students can see. Have ways to scaffold them to get there. Honor your standards. Those can inform your goals. But for each part of your lesson or learning experience, make sure you know the goals and engage learners in the goal setting process so that they see them and the goals as being relevant. They start seeing themselves and what's important and valuable to them in those goals. That really will help us design more culturally relevant teaching and learning practices with our students. We can't leave their voices out of it. The third stage, we already covered that. The third stage of the unlearning cycle is then to transform your tried and true techniques. So this can be really kind of fun. So you might pick a tried and true technique like, using Cliff Notes, or assigning homework, or when you share answer keys, or that students have to read the book before they watch the movie, or you need to use a number 2 pencil in math. Whatever a tried and true technique might be, you can then think about how you can transform that practice through anticipating variability, knowing the goal, and then using these UDL guidelines to think about how we might reduce a barrier and support engagement, representation, and action and expression. Those, of course, are those 3 UDL principles we've been talking about. They align with the neural networks of the brain, and we're going to think about how using those can help us to reduce barriers, to get us to those learning goals. So again, I invite you to take time to explore the udlguidelines.cast.org page if you want to spend a little bit more time in there. So if we continue to move around the unlearning cycle, first we understand variability, then we analyze our goals, then we think about our tried and true techniques, and then we want to make sure we are really prioritizing engagement. Engagement is learning's fuel tank. And this is one of my favorite images done by Lindy Johnson, and it shows the brain getting more and more full. As we move through our day, our brain gets tired. It takes energy to do all of this. In fact, right now, in the middle of this session, your brain might be feeling a little bit full. And when we do things like laugh or get food or take a break or do deep breathing or have a conversation with a friend or take what's in our head and write down notes and pause, that actually helps ease our cognitive load. Or if you have a graphic organizer, or if you already have a little background, or if you already are engaged in what you're doing, that can help ease that cognitive load. So we can think about, your students are going to vary in their cognitive load. So how can you design some scaffolds to support them? So when their brain is feeling full, when they're feeling, the emotions of all of their classmates and working with their peers and learning new things and having just been at lunch and going to gym class and all the things they do in the day, that they're able to use tools to help reduce their cognitive load so that they can get to the learning that we want them to get to. You never learn without emotions. There's never social emotional learning and then cognitive learning. So in fact, when we think of this cognitive load, it includes emotions. And so, these can be emotions, they could be threats, distractions, previous experiences, social interactions, food. I mean, this cognitive load builds, it ebbs and flows through the day. And you want to think of ways that you can help mitigate that for students and for yourselves. So I do invite you at this point to again, pause the video. Take a moment to reflect. What are you learning so far? Where is your energy, your engagement right now? And get a sip of water if you need to, do some stretches if you need to. Just take a few minutes to ease your cognitive load so you can engage in the last little bit of this session. So welcome back. Hopefully you paused there. And we just finished looking at the fourth stage of the unlearning cycle. Ultimately, with the unlearning cycle and with universal design for learning, we want to get learners to be expert learners themselves. So they're resourceful and purposeful and strategic and goal-directed, and they're motivated in their learning. So again, my colleague Katie and I, in our Unlearning book, we have this image, this idea that, there could be equality where students, there are 3 students and they get the same size stool to see a demonstration that's happening on a countertop. And we know that that is not going to benefit everyone. The same support won't benefit everyone. And we can push on equity to make sure that students are able to get different size stools so they can see the demonstration going on the countertop, and that is more equitable. But with expert learning, we start to recognize that the barrier to learning is the darn countertop in this example. So we try to reduce that countertop. We try to reduce the barrier and provide some flexible options in the design of the learning experience that any student can use from the beginning to get to the goal. So in that phrase there, notice how I talked about the goal, I talked about the flexible options, and this is the blueberry muffin, right? This is us putting the blueberries into the design of the learning experience from the very beginning. So anyone who walks through our door, any student with any learning label, any background, any barriers that we might traditionally think of them having can actually be reduced through the design of our learning experience. And so we've added, different size tables, different size, stools that can go up and down, different tools for the students themselves to be able to use, opportunities for students to work with the teacher or not, to work with their colleagues or not, to work online with students who may be, or experts from our community who may be remote. So this hybrid. So I invite you to take a moment, either on your own or with a colleague, vision what inclusion and equity looks like in your classroom, in this school, in your school. So this obviously is not it. This is just us taking some notes and thinking about how we can push on the design of our classrooms. Sketch it out, vision, really write down, what do you see? What do you hear? What are learners saying and doing in this equitably designed classroom of yours? Who is in there? Who is no longer excluded? Who is engaged in new ways? And how is the design supporting that? So again, please take a few moments to pause and reflect on your vision of inclusion and equity, what you're seeing and hearing and experiencing, and what's in the design from the beginning for your learners. We know small changes can have a profound impact. So if you think, oh my goodness, all I'm doing is, giving a flexible stool, that can go a long way to a student being able to better self-regulate and gain access to that content. So know that those small changes you're making can make a profound impact for learners. So that is our unlearning cycle, where you're understanding and valuing your variability. You're knowing your goals. You're analyzing some of your tried and true techniques, especially through the lens of engagement and scaffolding expert learner. So please take a moment and pause and reflect if you need to, but I want to try it. I want to get into an example and show you how you can use this unlearning cycle to implement UDL and design more equitable and inclusive learning experiences. So I tried to pick an example of something that I see a lot in classrooms, something that I did a lot as a teacher, something I still do in my work with adult learners and with graduate students, and that's cold calling names. Whether it's me just calling on you because you've raised your hand, or maybe I pick your name, with a popsicle stick or whatever it might be, this cold calling, I think, is an example that can, work across a lot of different contexts. But, maybe you want to pick something else. You could pick another, like maybe reading aloud to students as they listen, or assigning text to read for homework. You can try any of your tried and true teaching techniques. I'm just going to use this one for this example. So first, we know that there's going to be variability in student participation. Some are going to love to participate and be called on, and they're going to want to share, and they're going to want to talk, and others are not going to. Maybe, English isn't their first language. Maybe they weren't able to perceive what the question was. Maybe they just had a fight with a friend. Whatever the reason, there's going to be variability in student interest and engagement in participation. The preferences will vary from day to day. So I don't want to start to label, someone as a poor participator or a good participator. We want to truly recognize the variability of participation. So remember, this is the example. I'm working through the unlearning cycle. And so there'll be these jagged profiles of our learners in terms of this particular practice that I'm analyzing, participation in class. I want to then go to stage 2 and think deeply about my goal for student participation. What is it that I want students to be able to do when they participate? What does success look like? What is participation in my community looking like? So I just, started to jot down some ideas. For me, participation means each student is contributing in some way. They're exchanging ideas and they're deepening understanding of what they're covering. So whether it's on Twitter or what, there are flexible ways they might do it, but I then have this deep understanding of what success looks like, and I can share that with students themselves. So students know what success of participation is going to look like. So that's stage 2. Then stage 3 is the fun part. You start to transform this technique. So I can think about, how can I take this, cold calling method, whether it's popsicle sticks or just calling names, and transform it. So what are some options for engagement? How can I recruit student interest in this? If a student feels stuck and they don't know what to say, how could I maybe have some sentence starters, or have a graphic organizer for them to first be able to jot some notes down, or to turn and talk and ask a buddy? What are some options for students to build background? If they have no idea what we're talking about in the discussion and then I cold call them, they're not going to participate well. So how can I help them build their background around what we're talking about? How might there be some bulleted outlines or some pictures, or, quick video that they could watch so they start to understand the context a little bit more? And then finally, what are some options for action and expression? How could students participate in different ways? Maybe one option is to raise their hand. Maybe another could be to share in a back channel, like a Google Doc or a Slack kind of channel, or to use Post-its and put Post-its up on the bulletin board. There can be different ways for students to show me what they know. That counts as participation, because for me, participation didn't mean that you had to raise your hand. That doesn't happen in the real world. So I'm not going to get too caught up on students needing to raise their hand in participation. The 4th stage of the unlearning cycle requires that I really think deeply about prioritizing engagement. As students are participating in conversations, their brain is going to get full, they're going to get tired. What are some ways that they can document their thinking, that they can continue to be interested in what we're talking about and in participating, even if sometimes their ideas aren't ones that other people, seem to really value? What could be some ways that we minimize some of the threats and distractions that students might be experiencing as they're participating? And then ultimately, how am I scaffolding to these this expert participation? How are the learning spaces designed for this expert participation? Can I shift desks? Can I have flexible seating? Can I have items in the environment, like recording devices or voice typing options, or maybe even communication boards, to be able to make sure everyone is able to participate from the beginning? So that is the idea. You take any activity, like I took cold calling participation, and you put it through this unlearning cycle, and you use those UDL guidelines to think about how you can transform that technique in flexible ways so that you're really getting at this expert learning. So maybe you want to plug in here like a communication that you're giving to parents, or maybe you want to plug in there, a professional learning opportunity that's coming to staff. Maybe you want to plug in here, an opening activity that you have for a lesson. Pick a moment of your day-to-day learning designed and plug it into this unlearning cycle, and think about how you can then transform that technique into, or how you can transform that activity, that moment, that experience, into something that's more equitable and more engaging for all learners. So with that, I invite you to reflect on your takeaways. We took a journey talking about blueberry muffins, the UDL guidelines, the jagged learning profile and variability. We even brought some dinosaurs into the conversation, thinking deeply about participation and how we can use the unlearning cycle and the UDL guidelines to help us transform our learning experiences away from those tried and true practices, the way that, and we will then now be able to know that our barriers are in the environment, and that we can design to reduce those barriers to support the rigorous goals and inclusion of all learners. When we understand our variability of our learners and truly value it, when we really know our learning goals and what the success criteria are, when we then can set up options for engagement, representation, and action and expression, and prioritize engagement so we can get to expert learning, we're then taking many steps closer to designing for more equitable learning. So I do invite you to reflect on your takeaways, reflect on what you're going to go try. I thank you all for your time today. I have a couple ways, again, that you can reach out to me. Here's the Unlearning book by Katie Novak and myself. I also have Engage the Brain, How to Design for Learning That Taps into That Power of Emotion. I have a website you can check out. Again, find me at Twitter. That's my grad school address. You can also find me at CAST, aposey@cast.org. I love working there. I love the work that I get to do with educators to design for equitable futures. Thank you.